Hey, welcome back to the deep dive. Really glad you could join us.
Yeah, great to be here.
Today, we're diving into a topic that really gets to the heart of being human, I think. How we connect, how we seek attention, maybe,
Mm.
and sometimes the tricky ways that can manifest. We're looking at personality, behavior. It's a sensitive area, definitely. So we want to approach this with, a lot of compassion for others and maybe for parts of yourselves too.
That's so important, a gentle approach.
And a massive thank you to you for sending over the sources that are guiding us today. You shared some really fascinating stuff, a case report, articles on attention-seeking, HPD specifically, and some treatment research too.
Yeah, it's a great collection.
Seriously, getting to explore this material with you, it feels like a real privilege.
Really does. And I think our goal today, our sort of mission, is to take these pieces you gave us and try to unpack the complexities a bit.
Right.
Look beyond the surface judgments, you know, see what the sources suggest might be happening underneath it all. Let's just dive in and see what we find together.
Okay, sounds good. So let's start with the basics, maybe. Attention-seeking behavior. We all kind of have an idea of what that looks like, right? Those actions that seem, aimed at getting noticed. Maybe being really dramatic, telling big stories, needing to interrupt, that kind of thing.
Right. And what's interesting from the sources is that while it absolutely can look like someone just craving the spotlight or being self-centered, the material suggests it often signals something deeper.
Like what?
Like unmet emotional needs. The behavior itself can actually be a cry for help, in a way, or maybe an expression of anxiety or, just a sign of deeper struggles going on.
One of the articles you sent really spelled out some common causes for that. It mentioned things like unresolved emotional pain, maybe trauma, or not getting enough validation as a kid. Sometimes just learned habits even, loneliness too, or finding it hard to form healthy attachments.
Exactly.
So when you frame it like that, it starts to feel less like just give me attention and more like a call for connection, maybe?
That's a perfect way to put it, a call for connection. The sources really seem to lean that way.
Okay.
And they list some specific signs, too, things you might see, like an excessive need for validation from others, dramatic emotional swings, maybe unusual efforts to stay center stage, sometimes risky behaviors, or exaggerating things to get a reaction.
Right.
And it's important to remember, the sources suggest this isn't always, consciously manipulative. It's more about these ingrained patterns.
Yeah.
Unconscious, often.
Okay, so that's the general idea. Now, where does histrionic personality disorder, HPD, fit into this, according to the material you shared?
Okay. So HPD is specifically mentioned as a personality disorder. It's characterized by, excessive emotionality and this really pervasive need to be the center of attention.
So it's like that attention-seeking pattern, but really dialed up and part of the personality structure itself.
Exactly. It becomes a defining feature.
And what does that actually look like? What are the key features the sources mention for HPD?
Well, they describe things like feeling really uncomfortable when they're not the center of attention, a profound discomfort. They might use their physical appearance or their behavior specifically to draw notice, sometimes in ways that might seem inappropriate or sexually provocative to others.
Right.
Their emotions tend to shift rapidly and might seem kind of shallow to an observer. Very theatrical, dramatic presentation. And interestingly, they're often described as suggestible, easily influenced.
That case study you provided.
Wow.
Wow. It really brought that to life, didn't it? Though it sounded incredibly challenging.
It did. A very vivid picture.
The patient's behavior described as demonstrative, manipulative, focusing intensely on young male inpatients, the constant dramatization, exaggerated expressions, that persistent, sometimes provocative attention-seeking, and the overwhelming separation anxiety when they felt abandoned.
Yeah, you could really see how those specific behaviors line up with the broader HPD traits described in the other sources. It really shows the clinical reality. And, the sources also bring up the comparison that often comes up between HPD and narcissistic personality disorder, NPD.
Ah, yes, I saw that. They're both in that dramatic cluster, right?
But different.
Exactly. And the material highlights some really important differences.
Yeah, I found that part really helpful. One source mentioned HPD is less common, about 1% compared to maybe up to 5% for NPD.
That's the estimate, yeah.
And it mentioned HPD is diagnosed more often in women, but it also added a note of caution about why that might be. Maybe diagnostic bias or how it presents, not just pure numbers.
Right, that's an important nuance. But maybe the most crucial difference the sources point out is the motivation behind the attention-seeking.
Okay, tell me more.
So for HPD, the idea is they crave any kind of attention. It's
Yeah.
used for external validation. To shore up their self-worth, one source mentioned these deep, I am not important self-schemes. They need others to sort of affirm their value.
Got it. So any attention works. What about NPD then? With NPD, the sources suggest the craving is more for positive attention, admiration,
Yeah.
because they fundamentally believe they deserve it. It comes from an inflated sense of self-worth, not a lack of it.
Okay. That's a huge difference. Not just what kind of attention, but why they need it. That really changes how you understand it.
Exactly. It's a core distinction.
And there were other differences mentioned too, right? In how it plays out.
Yeah, the material notes HPD might actually allow for more capacity for empathy compared to NPD,
Interesting.
whereas NPD is described as potentially more likely to disregard or hurt others' feelings without much concern. You see those rapid, dramatic emotional shifts in HPD, which aren't typical for NPD.
Right.
And HPD individuals are often easily influenced, whereas someone with NPD might see themselves as superior, less likely to be swayed.
The sources also linked HPD more with things like somatic symptom disorder, conversion disorders, and mentioned that suicidal threats made specifically for attention seem more common in HPD presentations. It really paints a picture of different internal worlds driving these behaviors.
It really does.
Yeah.
Which leads us to the big question, right? Where does all this come from? What do the sources say about the roots of HPD and these attention-seeking patterns?
Yeah, it's clearly complex, not one single cause. But early life seemed to be a major focus in the materials.
Definitely. The sources suggest it's likely a combination: genetics, environment, social factors. But yeah, that environmental piece, particularly childhood experiences, gets a lot of emphasis.
They talked about things like childhood abuse, neglect, trauma, not getting enough emotional validation, chronic loneliness, stuff that could really interfere with learning healthy ways to feel secure or get needs met.
It makes a lot of sense intuitively.
Right.
And that research you included, the one specifically linking child abuse and neglect to HPD symptoms later in life, that was pretty stark.
It really was, finding that all dimensions, emotional, physical, sexual abuse, and neglect predicted HPD symptoms.
Right. All of them.
And that finding about neglect.
Wow.
That same study found neglect actually had the largest predictive effect, more than sexual abuse, even though all were predictors.
Yeah, that stood out to me too. It really underscores how maybe the absence of care, that lack of validation, can be uniquely damaging, leading to this intense need for external affirmation later on.
It's powerful stuff.
It is. And when you think about the psychological theories mentioned, Freud, object relations, Erikson, they all point to how crucial those early relationships are. Lack of warmth, inconsistent care, problems building basic trust. It leaves mark.
Yeah. It's not about blame, is it? It's about understanding how foundational those early experiences really are for shaping personality.
Exactly. Understanding the roots.
Okay, so knowing these potential roots, what about treatment? The sources, especially that case report, were pretty upfront about the challenges.
They were. The report described staff feeling things like helplessness, frustration, even hopelessness sometimes, working with the patient, because the behavior can be so intense.
Yeah.
And we mentioned diagnoses shifting, cases using up a lot of resources, frequent hospitalizations. For that patient, medication hadn't been successful.
Right. Which makes sense why the other sources really emphasize psychotherapy as the main approach, and specifically the relationship in therapy.
Exactly. That seemed key. And the research on clarification-oriented psychotherapy, COP, gave some clues about why that relationship matters so much.
How so?
Well, COP focuses on helping the patient understand their own patterns, especially in relationships, what drives their behavior.
Okay.
But here's the really interesting part from that research. Actual improvements in the therapeutic relationship itself were significantly linked to symptom reduction.
Wow. So like the patient trusting the therapist, being open, and the therapist being accepting, warm, believing in them, that connection.
Precisely. That connection seemed to be a major driver of change. It suggests that for HPD, maybe the quality of that therapeutic bond is almost the medicine itself, in a way.
That's fascinating.
Isn't it? It's not just about the techniques, but about meeting those deep needs for importance, reliability, solidarity, as one source put it, within that safe relationship. Feeling seen, accepted, secure. Maybe for the first time. It's profound.
That really is powerful. Okay, so bringing this back to everyday life. If we encounter this kind of behavior, maybe in someone we know, or even recognize bits in ourselves, how do we navigate it? That source on high conflict personalities had some practical thoughts.
It did. It framed HPD traits as potentially high conflict because that intense need for attention, the drama, blaming others, maybe embellishing facts, it can be really tough to handle, often driven by that deep fear of being ignored.
And it's so easy to get sucked in, isn't it? To react emotionally to the drama or the blaming, like that example email they gave.
Oh yeah, all caps, bold, crisis mode, pointing fingers.
Exactly.
But the core advice was, try not to get emotionally hooked.
Yeah.
Easier said than done, of course. But setting boundaries is crucial.
Okay.
That might mean limiting contact, if that's possible,
Right.
or finding ways to respond that don't actually reward or escalate the dramatic behavior.
And they mentioned that BIF idea, which I thought was really practical. Keep responses brief, informative, friendly, and firm.
Right, BIFF. The example is good. Someone responded to these big dramatic demands.
Like moving in or meeting money.
Yeah. And the response was calm, friendly, offered the option of therapy a constructive path, but was firm that the demands couldn't be met, and that communication would be limited unless they took up the offer of professional help.
It sounds hard, but makes sense.
Definitely not easy.
Yeah.
The source acknowledged that. It takes practice, emotional regulation on your end, but it's about protecting yourself while still trying to offer a path towards something healthier. Acknowledging the need without enabling the pattern.
Okay. Wow. Let's just take a moment to pull this together.
Yeah.
We started with attention-seeking generally,
Mm.
saw how it manifests more intensely in HPD according to the sources, explored those really deep potential roots in childhood experiences.
Yeah, the neglect piece was striking.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And then learned how vital that therapeutic relationship seems to be for healing.
It really circles back to a core idea, doesn't it? That behavior that feels frustrating or confusing often comes from a place of deep, unmet needs, from past pain. And understanding that, using the insights from these sources you shared, can help foster, well, more compassion, even when you absolutely need to hold firm boundaries.
That feels like a really important takeaway. Seriously, thank you again for bringing these particular sources to us. It was genuinely insightful to dive into this complex area using the material you provided.
We really hope this exploration offered you some valuable perspective, maybe for personal reasons, professional reasons, or just, wanting to understand the human condition a little better.
Absolutely. We really appreciate you spending your time with us for this deep dive. And hey, if you found it helpful or interesting,
Yeah.
we'd be so grateful if you'd consider subscribing to the channel. It just helps us keep doing these and you won't miss the next one.
That would be great.
And please, definitely come back and dive into another topic with us again soon. We'd love that.
Please do.
Until next time, keep that curiosity going and keep diving deep.
Take care, everyone.